All right, hello and welcome to week 2. So in week 1, we introduced the basic ideas of argument. So we talked about how arguments are composed of statements, and a statement is just anything that can be true or false. So you want to set aside any ideas you had about facts versus opinions. Everything that's in the form of an assertion that you could say, oh, that's true, that's false, it's a statement. And we're just going to wonder whether or not they are justified or not by the evidence. So an argument is composed of statements, some of which are taken to be evidence for other statements. We also introduced some basic ideas about how to evaluate argument, and that's where I want to pick up here. So in general, we said that whenever you encounter an argument, there are 2 checks you should run. There are 2 things you can look for. You want to check the reasons and you want to check the reasoning. This is because there are 2 separate ways an argument can go wrong. An argument could be wrong because its premises are false. So you check the reasons and it turns out the reasons aren't true. You can also check the reasoning, the thing that takes you from the premises to the conclusion. You ask, if the premises were true, would they support the conclusion? In general, this is something that you need to make a habit, right? If in the critical thinking version of this course, we would emphasize this endlessly. The point of critical thinking is to give you the habit of being a good reasoner in the real world. This is not the critical thinking version of this course. This is the logic version of this course. And so we're more interested in abstract ideas. So the next thing we took a look at was the idea of validity. We said that an argument was valid if it was impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false, right? So we had 2 examples of valid arguments. One of them makes perfect sense. All people are mortal. Socrates is a person. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Another version went, all people are carrots. Socrates is a person. Therefore, Socrates is a carrot. Both of these counted as valid because we weren't interested in the truth of the premises. We were interested in what would happen if the premises were true. And in each case, if the premises were true, then the conclusion would be true. Right? And so that brought out the idea of validity. But then in the exercises, there were some things that made things a bit more confusing. So one problem went like this. A forest ranger is surveying a park. I can tell that bears have been down by the river because there are tracks in the mud. And tracks in the mud like that are usually made by bears. We can't call this a valid argument because the tracks like that are only usually made by bears. Maybe they were made by campers pretending to be bears. So it's not valid, but it's still a pretty good argument. So we need another term to capture this sort of argument. There are a couple more like this. So in another one, Jack and Jill eat at the same restaurant and they both get sick, and so we infer that it was the restaurant that made them sick. It's pretty good, but it's not certain. And then in another one, we said that a trip would take 10 hours because it took 10 hours the last time. That's a generally reliable form of inference. You assume that the past is a good indicator of the future. But that's not perfect by any means. So what we're going to do is we're going to introduce a new idea. We're going to say that an argument can be strong. The difference between validity and strength is that validity makes the argument certain. The conclusion must be true if the premises are true. With strength, we just say that the conclusion is likely if the premises are true. So anything less than deductively valid counts as can count as strong. An important thing to note about validity is that validity is actually only possible in a very narrow range of situations. Basically, you have to imagine that you've got some perfect premises that are rigid enough to support a valid inference. So grammatical rules, logical rules, the rules of mathematics, these are common areas where we think we've got these kinds of rigid definitions. We also can imagine we also tend to think that some of our truths, some of the things we know are so perfectly verified that they would count. So all people are mortal, which I've been using as a standard example, is something that allows for validity. And then you can imagine hypothetical situations where you take a statement like all people are mortal and you just make up something and you imagine that that still has that level of rigidity. Those are the situations where validity is possible. Most of the rest of the time, we are only dealing with arguments that are strong. Okay, so actually we've got 4 terms that we want to deal with, because when we were talking in the previous week, we talked about both valid and sound. So we said an argument was valid if the premises make the conclusion certain, and then we add to that the idea of soundness. The argument is, let me go back and do that again. So we say that an argument is valid if the conclusion must be true when the premises are true. We add to that the idea of soundness, and we say that an argument is sound if it is valid and it has true premises. So we can come up with the same pair of statements for strength. So if the premises make the conclusion likely, were they true, we say that the argument is strong. Then you can add to that the idea of cogency. If, as a bonus, the premises are actually true, then we say the argument is cogent. So, 2 basic ideas, valid and sound. These are the pair of ideas from last week. An argument is valid if it is impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. And it is sound if it is valid and has true premises. So in the first case, you check the reasoning, and it turns out that the reasoning is perfect. In the second case, you additionally check the reasons, and it turns out that the reasons are true. The 2 pairs of terms that we are introducing for this week are exactly parallel, strong and cogent. So an argument is strong if the premises would make the conclusion likely, granted that they were true. And then if an argument is already strong and we add true premises, we say it's cogent. So with strength, you check the reasoning, and the reasoning is good enough. And then with cogency, you just check the reasons, and you also find out that the reasons are true. This leads us to a basic division in kinds of arguments. When you're trying to be valid, or sometimes people say when you succeed in being valid, we say that you are being deductive, right? And deduction is a form of reasoning that, as I was saying earlier, is only possible in very specific situations. And so our main example of deduction is going to be mathematics. Mathematics is, when you have 2 + 2 = 4, you've got a level of clarity that allows for valid reasoning. Most of the time in the real world, you're engaged in what we call inductive reasoning. So your arguments are going to be at best strong. So that means the conclusion is going to be likely but not certain. Almost any argument about the empirical world of our senses, the physical world that we deal with, is going to be inductive in this sense, because the actual world is messy, right? One important difference between deductive and inductive reasoning is that validity in the deductive realm is a yes or no thing. Arguments are either valid or they're not. In the inductive realm, things go by degrees. So something can be strong or stronger or even stronger than that. How strong does an argument have to be before it counts as strong, right? That's all going to depend on context. So what I said was, an argument is strong if the premises make the conclusion likely. How likely is likely? Well, maybe in the context you're in and with the amount of risk you're willing to take, 51% counts as likely. Maybe you're only going to be satisfied with an argument that gives you 95% certainty. All of these things are possible in the realm of induction because inductive arguments exist along a continuum, right? A line. So we can put all of our ideas together in a diagram like this. When we're dealing with deduction, our arguments can be valid, and if we're really lucky, they're sound. When we're dealing with induction, our arguments are strong, and if we're really lucky, they're cogent. So the next exercise that you have to do, again, asks you to evaluate arguments, but this time instead of just calling them valid or invalid, you can call them valid, strong, or weak.